It started with a leak in the ceiling of a $58 million penthouse, and it ended with a man standing in front of the most powerful boardroom in Ottawa, exposing a fraud that had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. But that part comes later. The morning Elise Beaumont-Carrier first noticed the stains spreading across the plaster above her home office, she didn't call her property manager. She didn't call the building superintendent. She sat in her wheelchair at the edge of her desk, looked up at the slow brown bloom on the ceiling, and thought about how much she hated people who assumed she needed help. She called the firm herself, gave them the address, told them to send someone Tuesday. They sent Theo. Theo Marceau showed up at 7:42 in the morning with a canvas duffel, a 4-year-old girl named Bia strapped into a yellow backpack carrier on his back, and a thermos of coffee he clearly hadn't had time to finish. He'd explained at the door, without apology, that his daughter's daycare didn't open until 8:30 and his first appointment was at 7:30, and that if this was a problem he understood completely and would reschedule. Elise had looked at him, then at the child, who was holding a small stuffed rabbit by one ear and staring at the chandelier with her mouth open. "The ceiling's in the back office," Elise said. "Try not to touch anything on the desk." That was how it began. Theo worked quietly. That was the first thing Elise noticed. Most contractors who came into her home, and there had been several since the accident, since the months of rehabilitation, since the restructuring of her entire life into something that fit inside a narrower set of physical coordinates, most of them talked too much. They over-explained things she hadn't asked about. They spoke slowly and clearly, as if the chair had somehow affected her capacity to understand building materials. They looked at her with that particular expression she had learned to recognize at 20 meters, the softening around the eyes, the slight tilt of the head, the careful cheerfulness that was really just pity wearing a polite costume. Theo didn't do any of that. He crouched under the access panel in the hallway ceiling, asked her 2 direct questions about when she'd first noticed the discoloration and whether she'd had any plumbing work done on the floor above in the past 18 months, wrote something in a small notebook, and went back to looking at the problem. Bia, in the meantime, had settled herself on the floor of Elise's office with the rabbit and a small coloring book she'd pulled from the duffel, and was humming something that might have been a song or might have been random tones. It was genuinely difficult to tell. "She does that," Theo said, passing the doorway with a section of pipe insulation. "She hums when she's comfortable somewhere. If she's quiet, it means she's nervous." Elise looked at the child on her floor. "She's not nervous," Elise said. "No," Theo agreed, "she's not." He found the source of the leak before 10 o'clock. A hairline fracture in the copper supply line running behind the wall between the kitchen and the office, small enough that it had been seeping slowly for months, long enough that the plaster was compromised in a section twice the size of the visible stain. He showed her photographs on his phone, explained what needed to happen, what it would cost, and how long it would take, in that order, without editorializing. "The line was replaced 2 years ago," he said. "Do you have the paperwork from that job?" Elise did. She kept every document related to the building in a set of labeled binders on the lower shelf. One of the many small reorganizations she'd made after the accident, not out of helplessness but out of efficiency. She handed him the folder. He read through it standing at the counter. Read it carefully, the way people read things they expect to find something in. "This is the wrong grade of copper," he said. She looked at him. "For a line under this pressure in a high-rise envelope, you'd want type K. What they installed was type M. It's thinner walled. It holds for a while, but in a building that flexes in temperature changes the way this one does." He tapped the page. "It's going to fail. Not if. When." "The company that did this job," Elise said. "What do you know about them?" "Verdant Build Group?" He set the folder down. "I know they've done a lot of work in buildings like this one, high-end residential. I also know they tend to spec materials that look right on an invoice but cost about 30% less than what they bill for." She was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known that?" "Long enough." She asked him to fix the line and come back the following week to assess the rest of the plumbing in the unit. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Each time he found something, not because the building was poorly constructed in any broad sense, but because someone had made a consistent series of small, careful decisions to use cheaper components in places where a client wouldn't easily notice, and to charge for better ones. It was methodical, it was deliberate, and it pointed every time back to the same company. Verdant Build Group had been hired, Elise knew, by her COO. His name was Armand. Armand Beaulac-Girard, her mother's brother's son, her cousin by blood, and her second in command at Beaumont Capital by a decision she had made 7 years ago when she'd believed family and loyalty were roughly synonymous. He had been with the company since the beginning. He knew the business the way a person knows the layout of a house they've lived in for years, not because they chose to learn it, but because they simply couldn't help absorbing it. He was good at what he did. He was also, she had started to understand, good at other things she hadn't noticed. She'd been in hospital for 11 weeks after the accident. She'd spent another 4 months in rehabilitation. During that time, Armand had run Beaumont Capital without her. The accident had been on a Thursday in February. She'd been driving back from a site visit in Gatineau, and a transport truck had run a red light on a road that was already compromised by black ice and poor municipal sanding. And the rest of it was the kind of thing she had stopped narrating in detail because the details didn't change anything. The investigation had determined fault. The insurance had been settled. The driver had lost his license. Her spinal cord had sustained damage at the T6 level, and she had not walked since. She was 41 years old, and she ran a $230 million investment and asset management firm from a wheelchair. And she had, in the first months, been so occupied with learning how to exist in a body that now required different logistics that she had not looked carefully at what was happening inside her own company. That was the window Armand had used. She didn't know all of it yet, but she was starting to see the outline. The pivot came the morning Theo was replacing the secondary shutoff valves behind the kitchen wall and found something that wasn't plumbing. It was a junction box tucked into a cavity that shouldn't have had one, connected to a secondary data line that ran parallel to the building's main network trunk. He stopped, took a photograph, called her over. "This isn't part of the building's infrastructure," he said. "Not any version of it I've seen in the specs." Elise looked at the junction box for a long time. "When was the kitchen renovation done?" he asked. 14 months ago, she said, "while I was in rehab." The renovation had been arranged by Armand. He'd overseen it as a courtesy, he'd told her, because she had enough to manage. He'd selected the contractors. He'd approved the work. She'd come home to a kitchen that was more accessible than it had been before. Lower countertops, different hardware, a layout she could navigate. And she'd been grateful, and she had not thought to look inside the walls. Theo came back the next day without Ba, who was at daycare, and with a network specialist he knew through a friend. The junction box was connected to a passive data tap, a device designed to intercept and copy network traffic moving through a specific part of the line. It had been there, from what the specialist could determine, for close to a year. Everything Elise processed through her home office, calls, files, financial documents, encrypted correspondence with the firm's compliance team, had been running through that tap. She sat in her kitchen afterward with a cup of tea she didn't drink and looked at the wall, which looked perfectly ordinary now, the way things always do once you know what's behind them. "You should talk to someone," Theo said. He was standing at the counter, his jacket back on, the duffel at his feet. "Not the police. Not yet." "Why not yet?" "Because you don't know what he has. You don't know what he's done with it. If you move too early before you understand the scope, you give him time to disappear what matters." He paused. "Do you have a lawyer you trust?" "Not one the firm uses. A personal one." She did. Her name was Priya, and Elise had known her for 15 years, and she did not share an office building or a referral network with anyone connected to Beaumont Capital. She called Priya that afternoon. What followed was 6 weeks that Elise would later describe, when she described them at all, as the quietest emergency she had ever lived through. On the surface, nothing changed. She attended the board meetings. She reviewed the quarterly reports. She responded to Armand's emails with the same measured cadence she always had. She gave no indication in any interaction that anything was different. Underneath, Priya was reconstructing 3 years of transactions. A forensic accountant named Renee, who was very good at her job and had the particular gift of finding things people had tried to make unfindable, was working through the firm's records with access Elise had quietly obtained through channels that bypassed the internal IT infrastructure entirely. What they found was not small. Armand had been, for 3 years, diverting client funds through a series of intermediary accounts connected to a shell entity registered in the Cayman Islands. The amounts were large enough to matter and small enough to avoid automatic flags. He had used the information from the data tap to anticipate compliance reviews, to redirect auditor attention, and to delete correspondence that would have raised questions. He had also, Renee discovered, been in negotiation with a private equity group to facilitate a hostile acquisition of Beaumont Capital, a deal in which he stood to receive a significant equity stake, contingent on his ability to deliver access to the firm's largest client portfolio. The acquisition was scheduled to close in 43 days. Elise looked at the documents Priya laid on her dining room table on a Thursday evening in March, spread across the space between them in the specific arrangement of someone who has organized information carefully so it can be understood in sequence. He used the data from the tap to know when to move, Priya said. He's been watching your communications for almost a year. He knew your rehabilitation schedule. He knew your re-entry timeline. He timed the acquisition process to close while you were still, by his calculation, not fully back. He miscalculated, Elise said. He did, Priya agreed. He underestimated how quickly you came back. They contacted the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit on a Friday morning, not the municipal police. That decision had been easy, given that 2 of the officers most familiar with commercial property matters in that district had, it emerged, received consulting fees from one of Verdant's affiliated entities. The federal route was cleaner and, in this case, the appropriate jurisdiction for what they were dealing with. The arrest happened on a Tuesday in the lobby of the Beaumont Capital building, and Elise was not there for it. She was in the boardroom on the 14th floor, standing, not sitting, standing, because she had learned in the past year to use a standing frame for certain meetings when the context called for it. At the head of the table, presenting to the board of directors the full account of what had been found and what had been done about it. The board members were 7 people she had known for between 4 and 12 years. Some of them she liked, all of them she respected, in the specific professional sense of the word that didn't require warmth. She had prepared for this meeting the way she prepared for every significant presentation. By anticipating every question, by removing every unnecessary element, and by knowing the material well enough that she could answer any version of any challenge without referring to her notes. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms are quiet when people are processing something that doesn't have an easy response. A board member named Douglas Fenwick, who had been with the company almost as long as Armand, and who Elise had watched carefully over the preceding 6 weeks for any sign of involvement, spoke first. "The acquisition," he said. "It was never going to be approved by this board." "No," Elise said. "It wasn't. He knew that, which is why he was trying to make board approval irrelevant." Another silence. "What do you need from us?" Douglas asked. "Patience," she said, "and a vote of confidence on record that I can show to the clients whose accounts were affected. They need to hear from this board that the governance structure holds, that this is not a company in crisis. It's a company that found a problem and handled it." The vote was unanimous. She drove home, or rather, Nadia, her driver, drove her home through Ottawa in the early evening. The sky above the river, that particular pale blue that only happens for about 6 weeks of the year, when winter is finished but the trees haven't fully leafed yet and the light has somewhere to go. She sat in the back seat and looked at it. Theo's truck was parked outside her building. He was sitting on the front steps with Bea asleep against his shoulder, the rabbit tucked under Bea's arm, both of them in the last of the day's warmth. He stood when he saw the car. Not quickly, carefully, because of the child, and Bea stirred and resettled without fully waking. "You didn't have to come," Elise said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to hear how it went." She looked at him. At the sleeping child on his shoulder, the ease with which he held her, the way he'd come here at the end of what was probably a long day simply because he wanted to know. Not because he had a stake in it. Not because it affected him in any measurable way. Just because he'd been part of it from the beginning, and, apparently, that meant something to him. "It went well," she said. He nodded. The slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth that she had come to understand was his version of a genuine smile. Not the performed kind, not the kind meant to reassure her, just the quiet acknowledgement of something that had turned out the way it should. "Good," he said. They stood there for a moment in the pale blue evening, neither of them in a hurry to go anywhere. Bea shifted again, mumbled something, and began to hum, low and tuneless and utterly content. "She's comfortable," Elise said. "Yeah," said Theo, "she is." There was a job offer in her pocket, a formal one, drafted by Priya, for a new position she'd created in the past week. Director of Facilities Security and Infrastructure Oversight, a role that had not existed at Beaumont Capital before, and that would require someone who understood buildings the way some people understood financial instruments, as systems where small, hidden flaws compound silently until they become catastrophic, and where the difference between safety and disaster is often the quality of attention brought to things that don't look important from the outside. She hadn't given it to him yet. She would eventually. When the moment was right, which she had learned over the past several months was not always the moment you expected. For now, she sat in the early evening and listened to a child hum and thought about how much had been rebuilt in the past year. Not just the plumbing, not just the boardroom, not just the company, but the particular kind of trust that only forms between people who have seen each other at their most unguarded and decided, without ceremony, to stay. That was worth more than the $58 million penthouse. It was worth more than the $230 million firm. It was, she thought, the thing that had actually been missing before the accident and the ceiling stain and the man who showed up on a Tuesday morning with a 4-year-old on his back and a thermos he hadn't had time to finish. Not everything that falls apart, it turns out, falls apart for nothing. I keep thinking about the ceiling stain, not the fraud, not the boardroom, not the arrest. The ceiling stain. That slow brown bloom that Elise looked up at one morning and decided to handle herself without calling anyone to do it for her, without waiting for someone else to decide it was worth fixing. That's where everything started. Not with a villain, not with a conspiracy. With a woman who still trusted her own judgment when the world had given her plenty of reasons to stop. I think about what Armand must have believed, that the accident had softened her somehow, that 11 weeks in a hospital and 4 months in rehab would leave her less than she was before. That the chair would slow down her thinking the way it slowed down her movement. He watched her come back and he miscalculated, and I don't think the miscalculation was about strategy. I think it was about character. He didn't understand that the people who survive hard things and keep going aren't weaker for it. They're just quieter about what they know. Theo didn't know he was walking into anything. He showed up to fix a pipe with a 4-year-old on his back and a thermos of coffee he hadn't had time to finish, and he did his job the way people do their jobs when they actually care about doing them well. Carefully, honestly, without inflating what he found or minimizing what it meant. When he found the junction box, he could have called his company, filed a report, moved on. Instead, he thought about what it meant for the person living in that space. That's not something you can teach someone. That's just who you are. I think about what it means that two people like that found each other in the middle of something like this. Not romantically, or not only that, and maybe not yet, but in the way that matters more, at least at first, they recognized each other. She recognized that he was exactly what he appeared to be, which is rarer than it sounds. He recognized that she didn't need protecting, she needed to be taken seriously. That's the kind of respect that actually holds. What Armand did was wrong in every straightforward sense. It was theft, it was betrayal, it was a calculated abuse of trust built over years. But the reason it worked for, as long as it did, wasn't because he was clever. It was because he assumed that the people around him were paying less attention than they were. That assumption is always the thing that brings it down. You cannot build something lasting on the premise that other people are not paying attention. Elise paid attention. She paid attention to the pipe, to the paperwork, to the grade of copper that wasn't right, to the question of who had hired the company that installed it. She paid attention when it was inconvenient, when she was still rebuilding her own life, when she had every reason to leave certain things to other people. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't take breaks. It's not something you apply when it's easy. It's what you do when nobody's watching the ceiling and you are. And Bea hummed. The little girl who only hummed when she was comfortable. I think about that too. Because sometimes the truest measure of a place, or a person is whether a child feels safe enough to make noise.